So what I'm going to say is by no way going to reflect any official position by NATO, a member state, or the CCOE. Now, having said that, next slide, please. I've got the pleasure to be the last speaker now before the questions, before the Q&A. So I've taken many notes, and even though I didn't see the other presentations before, I think this fits quite neatly now. Of course, having given you the disclaimer, I know you're probably going to look in my direction for the NATO role in this. So I think I can give you some ideas here. Also for CIMIC and CMI, but in the end, and that's the other disclaimer, it is a difficult topic. There are no easy solutions. And while I cannot give you the right answers to every question here, I look forward to a good discussion in the end. So next slide, please. This is not meant to give you certain uncontested definitions here, but to make you aware that for this topic, cybersecurity, cyber wildcard, perhaps even more than for any other topic, it is important to agree what you're speaking about, because you easily find people using terms with a meaning that they think that is the meaning to them, but there's a different meaning to somebody else. So it's not about giving you those definitions now, but keep that in mind when you have these conversations with other people. I'd like to start with the domain of operations, and both speakers before me have touched upon this. So cyberspace is a domain of operations, not only for NATO, but also for many member states, for the EU. That has to do with a mindset that comes with that domainship, as it were. Cyberspace is ever contested, and Joseph has more or less touched upon this. Everything these days that has got a ship and connects to a network is part of cyberspace and hence vulnerable, right? And we rely on it still because it is a human-made environment, that technology, that IT, that cyberspace is made of. This is something important to keep in mind. And now that this is a domain, that doesn't mean we're going to militarize this. And we will come back to that term at the end of the presentation. But it may be helpful to apply some sort of analytical military thinking that comes from this craft, as it were, to approach the problems. And that won't be the only valid perspective, but it can help. Now, cyber war, cyber incidents, cyber attacks, espionage, and what have you. So I tend to avoid the term cyber war, and if it comes, it will probably not be cyberspace alone, but together with the other domains, perhaps in a hybrid construct. We just don't know that. I prefer to talk about a cyber incident and perhaps espionage being something that is not a nice thing, but it is accepted between states, and states can respond to this, but it's not an active warfare, right? Whereas cyber attack normally comes with a common connotation of, okay, this is comparable to an armed attack. So things get damaged permanently, physically, or people may be injured or die. What I mean to say is we just got to be precise about these things, which is also why I do not prefer to use cyber as a noun, because that's all or nothing. Critical national infrastructure, which is in the hands of nations, member states, private sector normally, but not exclusively. Your mileage may vary, which is again already where we touch upon the aspect information sharing. Gio touched upon this. So, well, everybody wants information to be shared. Perhaps nobody wants to share, I don't know. Generally speaking, if you're weak in some areas, when you know something's not good or not secure enough in your critical national infrastructure, are you going to share this? Layers of cyberspace. There are different models, and we could advance to the next slide for a second, please. It doesn't really matter so much which model you actually take. There's a physical layer normally, and you could subdivide it. There's a logical layer, and there's in many models a social layer. And if effect can be achieved anywhere. It could be at a physical layer, cables, even, right? Hardware, but even on a social cognitive layer. So that is something as an analytical tool where the effects take place, and this is directly connected to the next point. For hybrid threats, are cyber effects, not cyber, right? An enabler, yeah, well, sure. For many other effects, it is just one piece of the puzzle, right? It may be the only desired effect, and perhaps it is about breaking something in the physical domain that has a chip in a network. But many times we see this as part of a bigger operation that may comprise other elements too. And finally, the defender's dilemma. Both speakers before me touched upon this. So the others only need to be right once, only need to punch through once, and we gotta be good at defending all the time. Yes and no again. I think Gio really had a point when saying, okay, these things happen. We can't stop it from happening. It's a matter of probability. So we got to prepare. So let's not be the low-hanging fruit still. Let's see to be as secure as possible, but there are no guarantees, and that is also, of course, a moral hazard for decision makers, right? It's about risk management, and that costs money normally, right? And you could always say, okay, how much could I have done? And you might get out of the situation. Well, that's not how we should approach the situation. Now, going to the next slide, please. One more even to the incident response cycle. Now, again, there are different models, though. This is the standard one with the nicest graphics. So I've taken one from the internet. Let's abstract a bit on this. Preparation. In the military, we often talk about readiness through exercises, through planning. I think this is something that applies here too, right? Because as we have heard, you cannot avoid being hacked, if you like. It may happen. There's a certain likelihood, so you got to prepare for that. Then once it happens, the challenge is to detect it, because this may go unnoticed for quite a while. It depends on your own capabilities, right? If and when you will detect something, you want to react. So we will come to the response, and that may be for the very incident, containing it, recovery measures, right? To ensure business or mission continuity, but also like another kind of response, like nation states may want to address this publicly or may not want to do this, right? So this is not something that is limited to the technical layer, and we should keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So let's make a short digression to the question of deterrence. And, deterrence, that comes from the good old nuclear thinking, and it's debatable. It is being debated, and probably a question as debatable as arms control and verification for cyberspace. Now, to make this a bit more salient, to make this more tangible, just an example with some analogies. So take Ralph, our nice presenter, right? So you've seen him, handsome man in his best age. And if I hold a grudge on Ralph and I may want to punch him, I could do that or not do that. And the short answer is I'll probably not do that, because I know Ralph is much stronger than me, so I'll be deterred, right? Now, the more verbose answer, the more detailed answers. Let's look at this at a bit more detail. So I could punch Ralph, but I know that probably it will make a difference. He could evade my punch, or I know if I can punch him two times, 3 times, he'll remain standing. So he's resilient. So that is a bit of deterrence by denial, right? So whatever I want to do to Ralph doesn't have the effect. Perhaps I'm not strong enough. Perhaps Ralph is just much better, right? So what happens after that? Ralph may decide to punish me, right? And he can do that because he knows that the punch comes from me. He can attribute that punch to me because I must be in sight and in range for me to do that in order to punch him. So he could punch me back, he could kill me, whatever, but he's also a civilized man. He may just do something else, like not invite me to a seminar anymore, or just report me to the police, right? So there's no need for a response in kind. That's a decision, right? But normally attribution is key to punishment, right? So this is why some people think, okay, deterrence by attribution perhaps is a bullet point of its own. Also, perhaps talking about public attribution, or in this example, reporting me to the police or whatever, making a statement to the press, right? Well, that is something that he may or may not do. But you can take this example a bit further, because I know that Ralph would see my punch coming. I won't be effective, right? He might punish me later. I may choose to take another course of action. I may actually engage some thugs, right? To beat him up in the streets. And I may even let it look like an accident, right? So attribution will not be for granted, and it may be more efficient. All right, so, okay, let's stop this uncivilized example. I'm just trying to give you the idea of thinking, of deterrence thinking. Even though it's contested, it has some relevance to the topic, because resilience is a means to deny somebody else's objectives, right? And this is something that we should keep in mind. Now, going to the next slide, please. What can we do? So, of course, situational awareness, that is to make informed decisions, because nobody wants to make decisions in the dark, right? This may be about correlation, even between states, right? Okay, something's happening in my country, oh, in your country too. Might this be related? And there are platforms for that, right? So that's one thing. And then, of course, knowing your own terrain, your own capabilities, the other team's capabilities, you may even be able to predict the next steps or some probability, right? Which may help you to make informed decisions. But without situational awareness, you're on the dark, right? And you could still take some actions, obviously, but you want to be prepared. So Gio said, okay, what's important? The crown jewels. Knowing what needs the highest degree of protection in my area of responsibility. That makes sense, because it all comes at a cost, right? And you can't be everywhere. Make a plan, right? Because, I mean, intrusions happen. It's a matter of probability, especially when you've got a high profile, you'll attract some errors, right? You know that, so you got to make a plan, and you make other incident response plans, like in case of a fire in your building. So you also would do that for cyber incidents, obviously. And then we quickly talk business continuity, or in the military also mission continuity, right? So the prime example for this is the so-called PACE plan, primary alternate contingency emergency. And let's just take this WebEx as an example. And Ralph said it, there are some network IT, whatever works today. So they've got a plan, right? If the connection breaks down, also me as a briefer, we talked before, so there's a dial-in number for me. I've got my own slides, I could present them. They've got the slides right now. So these are just things, that you should be clear about before business starts, right? So you can better react later. And of course, I love that sentence, resistance through redundancy costs money, right? And these are discussions that we need to have with decision makers, right? Consequence management, right? So in the end, it would be an informed decision to accept a given residual risk then, or rather build in redundancies, other measures, plans, right? So this is the readiness, the preparedness part. Now, analog resilience is a term that I coined in a German military in a specific area some years ago. This is essentially about being independent, as independent as you could be of cyberspace assets, right? So we know they are not for granted, okay? And what can you do about this? This is a bit about the PACE plan. And that PACE plan would then include analog means. And just consider that I grew up in a time when the internet it did exist, right? But it wasn't everywhere. So I didn't have a smartphone with Google Maps. So when I would go somewhere, I'd have to take a map, like on paper, right? And perhaps even a pencil. I'd make some notes. At one point in time, okay, I could print something from the internet, but not in the beginning. And we learned that, right? Especially in the military, we learned that. And that helps even when your smartphone or your computer or what have you, for whatever reason, suddenly doesn't work anymore. Now, this is more easily said for individuals and organizations than for societies, but it's a mindset thing that also comes with the domain, right? Nothing's for granted anymore. Cyberspace is contested, like it or not, right? And we don't have to play along, but it is something that we need to prepare for. So let's not take it for granted. There are concepts, and this is not a technical presentation. Zero trust defense in there, reducing your attack surface. Just take the CCOE logo. It's not about ads for that other center of excellence, but just take the icon there. You know, there are different layers, like layers of an onion. So you make it in on a bottom left side, right? But you cannot continue there as an attacker, as an intruder. So that makes it more difficult. That imposes costs on the attackers. And that is also a way of, well, deterrence by denial or just denial. And in the end, it may be possible with sufficient effort to get in and get what you want, but it's just more difficult. This is also, yeah, because there is no 100% security. We've heard that the show must go on even when somebody manages to intrude. So make it more difficult and have a plan in place, because it is just so complex that there is a certain likelihood that all your defenses fail, or at least some of your defenses fail. And this is not because we're not good enough, not necessarily. It is about, like, I wrote that down on a slide, proper software engineering, and Joseph pointed upon, touched that. It's just so complex that no single individual can fully understand every piece of software that you run and that you rely on. And we've come to accept a certain standard that may be lower than in other domains. You know, if your computer doesn't work, you just restart it, right? That's what we grew up with. That kind of thinking may be dangerous, but you know, it's also about being resilient and knowing what to do just in case. Now, enough about that. Next page, talking a bit about NATO. So NATO is a political military alliance that involves political consultations, obviously, but it's centered on and around the military instrument of power. So a follow-up question is then always, okay, in a particular case, in a particular situation, what can the military instrument of power reasonably do about this? When you look at NATO, there are always at least two perspectives. NATO as an organization, like an IO, with its own legal status, own networks, and this is where it becomes interesting, but also as an alliance, right? And that's not the same. As an organization, we in NATO have got IT that we own, and of course, we need to take care of the protection of that IT security. Makes sense. Beyond that, as an alliance, we quickly talk about critical national infrastructure again, and I think I mentioned it. That is mostly in the hand of member states. No, it is in the hands of member states, and they're mostly in the private sector, right? So it's the nation's prerogative how to what extent they want to control that through national legislation and perhaps even owning something. NATO's got a cyber defense pledge. You can Google that. So this is essentially the nation's DLS saying, okay, these are the measures that we want to put in place. It's a pledge, a promise, right? But in the end, even though there are reports, every nation is free to decide what they want to offer and how they follow through. Talking about NATO's core tasks: collective defense, crisis response, and cooperative security. Yeah. What we can do to increase security and like collective defense. That's the preparedness part again. Of course, NATO is also a platform to share information and also intelligence, right? But in the end, whatever NATO does must be agreed at 30, right? Because we are 30 allies right now. It's the consensus principle. So yeah, that, you know, whatever situation emerges, that's then just a decision between between the allies in the Council, the North Atlantic Council, whether NATO as a whole wants to react. Of course, bilateral mutual agreements, assistance is always possible. Again, the platform thing here, even support from NATO as an organization to allies is something that is possible within a given framework. And ultimately, these things are political decisions, right? And we're talking about Article 4 and Article 5 of the Washington Treaty here. So consultations if a member state feels threatened. And of course, collective defense, Article 5, again, a political decision. Now, preparing for the discussion, I'd like to, next slide, please, recap a few ideas from the hybrid seminar, namely Chris Cremidas Courtney's presentation. So he touched upon resilience as deterrence. I think I've touched upon the deterrence point of view, which is contested, but it is a valid lens. So hybrid as a way to achieve political objectives on the cheap. Yeah, and you also mentioned it, low entry barriers by and large, right? So more or less anyone, David versus Goliath, could make a difference here. That's not to say that nation states aren't the biggest player there, right? So detect, attribute, respond, recover. Keeping in mind when you talk about incidents, you cannot always attribute, and attribution is not a technical exercise. That is one part of it, but you must also be able to respond and recover even though you can't or cannot yet attribute it. Can't search a relationship. That's interesting also when we talk about information sharing, right? And perhaps even intelligence sharing. Intelligence sharing is a lot about trust, right? And that's the last point. Once the crisis begins, you can still try and build relationships, but then you're up against time, and what you've built already is what you'll have to work with, right? And again, I think I put it on a previous slide, attribution is a sovereign decision of any nation. So NATO as an organization doesn't attribute. NATO as an alliance even doesn't attribute, even though allies may at one point decide at 30 to make a statement, right? Next slide. What can CIMIC and or CMI do? Okay, key role in support to civilian authorities. We'll talk about that in a minute. There are perhaps some limitations to that. Key role in building resilience, perhaps in the other domains, assisting with detection and attribution. You can read the rest for yourself. And something also an interesting point that I found on the slides of multinational core Northeast. NATO's got NATO force integration units in some newer member states, and that was an interesting idea about that. But again, when we talk about critical national infrastructure, that's the nation's prerogative, right? So you only get as much information as the nation is willing to share, and there may be some leeway for you by building trust, right? But you also need to be trustworthy yourself in terms of, okay, does it make sense for them to share it with you? What can you give in return, right? And how secure will the information be with you? Because if they know that perhaps your own systems are too vulnerable beyond a reasonable point, then they may not be willing to share information. Final slide, please. Is cyberspace different? Is it not different? And what can CIMIC or CMI do? So I know our moderators are going to sum this up before the discussion. So there are the traditional domains, and we've learned something. We've set some standards in the traditional domains, and a lot of analogies exist and are valid, but some are not. And for that, let's recall what picture we have of CIMIC and CMI. And I think this picture is very much influenced by stability and peacekeeping missions over the past 20-ish years, 25 perhaps, and not so much like collective defense, right? So in such a scenario where the military isn't there to provide secure conditions in the first place for others to then hopefully build upon that, what's the role of the military in the situation in the first place, right? Because I think from that, a lot of the answers comes from, right? So to give that answer, like what can CIMIC CMI do? Okay, what does the military do in the first place? Talking about critical national infrastructure in this case, could it be an opportunity to try and liaise with public and private sector entities? Well, perhaps, but have our CIMIC people got the expertise for that? They are now SMEs, right? And certain information sharing relationships wouldn't ideally already be in place, right? And trust would have been built. And that's not necessarily in this case by the CIMICers, because cyberspace and IT as a domain builds up on IT infrastructure, right? And that is mainly in the hand of public and the private sector and not the military. Have they got the authority? Is the military in charge in the first place again? But at least we can talk about protection of own military systems, and there may be, again, some room. And of course, the coordination dilemma, and we've said it for a long time, everybody wants coordination if you ask them, but nobody really wants to be coordinated, if you know what I mean. CIMICers know that. We know that between different public institutions, federal level, horizontal and vertically. Yeah. And finally, militarization of cyberspace. We had that with Jiro. We had that with Chris Kremidas-Courtney's presentation some months ago. It's difficult. Do we want to give this in the hand of the military, and have they got the capability? So that is a capability question, a capacity question. It's also a societal question, perhaps a legal question. I don't know. But, I mean, I could give you my private opinion. I'll hold that back for a moment because this now concludes my presentation, and I look very much forward to a good and lively discussion. Thank you. Over.